The dinner table had 6 chairs that night, but only 4 of us were eating. My son had moved the other 2 into the garage months ago, and I never asked why. I should have. That was the first sign I missed. My name is Bernard Alcott. I'm 67 years old, retired electrician, 31 years with the same company before my knees told me it was time to stop climbing ladders. My wife, Lorraine, passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After that, the house we'd shared for 32 years felt like a museum I was the only visitor of. My son, our youngest, called me 2 weeks after the funeral. "Dad, you shouldn't be alone in that house." He was right, so I went. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened. I didn't move into my son's house. I moved into a house that I helped him buy. We sat at a kitchen table, the old one from my garage that his mother used to refinish every 10 years, and I wrote a check for $82,000 as a down payment on a 4-bedroom colonial in Ashford, Connecticut. I handed it to him directly. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything, then looked up at me and said, "Dad, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let me have the back bedroom," I told him, "the one with the window facing the yard." He laughed. We shook hands. That was our arrangement. His wife, my daughter-in-law, who I will call by her relationship to me because she stopped deserving a name in my house long before I stopped living in it. She was pleasant enough in the beginning. Politey. She asked about my appetite, whether I needed extra blankets, whether the television in my room was loud enough. She was performing helpfulness the way some people perform happiness at work parties. You can always tell. The smile is a second too wide. The eye contact a beat too long. I didn't say anything. Lorraine would have spotted it in 5 minutes, but Lorraine wasn't there, and I told myself I was being unfair, reading into things because I was still grieving, still adjusting. I was 63 years old, newly widowed, living in my son's guest room. Of course I was on edge. The first year was manageable. I paid for groceries twice a month, not because anyone asked me to, but because it felt right. I covered the property taxes in full the first spring, $4,400, wrote the check without being asked. When their water heater failed in November, I handled it. When my daughter-in-law wanted to redo the kitchen backsplash, I said sure and paid for the tile. I didn't keep a list. I wasn't keeping score. That was my mistake. By the second year, the pleasantries had thinned. My daughter-in-law stopped asking about my appetite. She started leaving the kitchen when I came in for coffee in the mornings, not in an obvious way, just a quiet disappearing, a sudden reason to be somewhere else. I noticed, but didn't want to notice it. My son noticed it too, I think, but my son has always been better at not seeing things he doesn't want to see. Her parents started coming around more. They'd drive up from Milford on Sundays, stay for dinner, sometimes stay past 9. Her father would sit in the living room armchair, my chair, the one I brought from home, and stretch out like he owned the place, which, legally, he didn't. Morally, he absolutely did not, but nobody seemed to care about either of those things except me. One Sunday, her mother pulled my daughter-in-law aside in the kitchen and said something I wasn't supposed to hear. The house was quiet. I was in the hallway. "He's never going to leave on his own," she said. "You know that." I stood very still. My hand was on the wall. "I know," my daughter-in-law said. That was all. They moved to a different part of the kitchen, and I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, looking at the window facing the yard. The oak tree Lorraine would have loved, the bird feeder I'd hung myself in the fall. I didn't say anything to my son. Not yet. 3 weeks later, my daughter-in-law knocked on my bedroom door on a Tuesday evening. My son wasn't home. He travels for work, medical device sales, gone 2 or 3 nights a week. She waited until he was gone. I've thought about that a lot. She sat in the chair by the window, the small one I'd brought from Lorraine's reading room, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she told me that things had become complicated, that she and my son were thinking about the future, about their space, about having room for their lives to grow. She used words like restructuring and boundaries and long-term sustainability. She sounded like a corporate memo addressed to a man whose name wasn't worth learning. "We think it might be time to look at other arrangements," she said. She didn't look at me when she said it. I asked her what she meant by other arrangements. She said there were very nice independent living communities nearby. She had even looked a few up. She pulled out her phone and showed me a website. Green lawns, smiling people, a dining hall with round tables. I looked at the screen for a moment. Then I looked at her. "This is your house?" I asked. She paused. "Excuse me. Is this your house? Did you buy this house?" She put her phone down. "Bernard, I wrote an $82,000 check for this house," I said. "I paid 4 years of property taxes. I replaced the water heater, the front gutters, the kitchen tile you picked out. I want to make sure I understand the conversation we're having." She sat very straight. She said that financial contributions didn't change the dynamic of the household, that it wasn't about money, that it was about what was best for everyone. I told her I needed some time to think. She left. I sat in Lorraine's reading chair and I thought about the dining room with 6 chairs, 2 of which were in the garage. I thought about Sunday mornings and the armchair and her mother's voice saying he's never going to leave on his own. I thought about my son, away in a hotel room in Providence or Hartford or wherever he was that night, probably having dinner alone, probably not thinking about this at all. I called my son. I told him we needed to talk when he got home. He came home Thursday. We sat in the kitchen, not at the old table from my garage that had been replaced 2 years in with something she'd found at a furniture store in New Haven, and I told him what his wife had said. I watched his face. He didn't look surprised. That was the part that stayed with me. He looked tired and guilty and sorry, but he did not look surprised. "Dad," he said, "she's my wife." I nodded. I told him I understood that completely. "I just think maybe she has a point about the space." "She showed me brochures," I said. "She had them ready." He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at the table. He said he thought maybe we could all talk together, work something out, find a middle ground. I told him there was nothing to work out. I told him I was going to handle it. I don't think he knew what I meant by that. I don't think she did either. What I did next, I did quietly and without any announcement. I've lived 67 years, and I've learned that the loudest thing a man can do is act when no one expects him to. I contacted a real estate agent the following Monday. Her name was Patricia. No, I won't use names in this story except my own. She was a woman who'd been selling houses in the Ashford area for 20 years and who understood exactly what I was looking for without me having to explain it twice. I told her my price range. I told her what I needed. She called me back in 4 days. There was a house for sale, directly across the street. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, built in 1987. Good bones, updated HVAC, a covered front porch that faced east. And from the living room window, you had a clear, unobstructed view of the colonial with the 4 bedrooms and the kitchen tile and the oak tree that Lorraine would have loved. I made an offer the next day. Cash. We closed in 18 days. I didn't tell my son. I didn't tell my daughter-in-law. I hired a moving company for a Thursday, his travel day, and I moved what was mine, which was more than they'd realized, because I'm a man who keeps good records and photographs of what belongs to him. The chair from Lorraine's reading room, my tools from the basement, the bird feeder from the yard. I took it down and wrapped it in newspaper and put it in a box. I left a note on the kitchen counter. Simple, 2 sentences. I've made other arrangements, as requested. I wish you well. Then I walked across the street, sat down in a folding chair in my empty living room, and I waited. I want to tell you what it felt like, because people always want to know about the revenge, the power move, the drama. But that's not what I felt. What I felt was quiet, a very specific kind of quiet that I hadn't had in 4 years. Since the hospital, since the 11 weeks, since the museum with no other visitors. I sat in that empty room with the afternoon light coming through the east-facing window, and I felt, for the first time in a long time, like myself. My son called at 7:30 that evening. I let it ring. He called again at 8. I answered. "Dad, where are you? What's going on? Your room is." "I'm across the street," I told him. There was a long pause. "What?" "I bought the house across the street. I moved in today. I have a nice view of the yard." Another pause. I could hear him breathing. "Dad, your wife asked me to find other arrangements. I found them. I think they suit me very well." He came over that night. He stood on my porch with his hands in his pockets, looking at me through the screen door. And he said he hadn't known she was going to do that, say those things, go that far. I'm not sure I believed him. But I opened the door. We talked for 2 hours. We said things to each other that were long overdue. About Lorraine, about the years after, about how he'd let his wife lead him somewhere he hadn't fully chosen to go. He cried, briefly, the way men our age cry when they finally stop pretending something didn't happen. I did not cry. I'd already done that part. I told him I loved him. I told him nothing between us had changed. I told him that the house across the street, was not a punishment. It was a boundary, the kind I should have drawn years ago, before I wrote any checks, before I handed over anything that mattered. He nodded. He said he was sorry. I believed that part. What I did the following week, I also did quietly. I called the accountant who had handled Lorraine's estate and mine for 15 years. I told her to begin the process of restructuring my financial contributions, the automatic transfer I'd had going to my son's account. $1,200 a month, what I called household support, though no one had ever asked me to name it that. I stopped it, the arrangement I'd had with a mortgage servicer, where I made supplemental payments on the colonial's principal each quarter. I stopped that too. There were also 2 credit cards that had been in my name with my son listed as an authorized user, that I closed. None of this was done in anger. I want to be clear about that. I closed those accounts the same way I closed my eyes each night, because the day was over and there was no reason to keep them open. My daughter-in-law didn't speak to me for 6 weeks. Fine. My son came over most Sundays. We watched football. I made chili. The real kind, from a recipe that was technically my father's, but that I'd been adjusting for 40 years until it became mine. He always had seconds. The mortgage on the colonial, it turned out, was harder to manage without the supplemental payments. I heard this from my son, not as a complaint, just as a statement of fact one Sunday in November. He said they were going to have to refinance. He said my daughter-in-law was picking up extra shifts. He said this without bitterness. Had I listened without satisfaction, or tried to? I'm not going to pretend there wasn't a small, very human part of me that felt something when he said it. I'm 67, not a saint. What I felt more strongly was this. I had spent 4 years in a house where I was tolerated at best and managed at worst. I had poured money into a foundation that was never mine to stand on, and now I was sitting in my own living room in a house with my name on the deed, with a porch that caught the morning light and a window that looked out onto the street where my son's car sat in the driveway every Sunday. That was enough, more than enough. It's been 14 months since I moved across the street. My daughter-in-law knocked on my door last March. She stood on the porch with her hands at her sides, and she said she owed me an apology. She looked like it cost her something to say it, which made me think it was real. I thanked her. I didn't invite her in, not that time, but I thanked her. My son and I are fine. We are more fine in some ways than we have been since before Lorraine died, Because now when we sit in my kitchen on Sunday evenings, we are two men choosing to be there, not one man hosting and one man being housed. That difference is not small. I understand it now in a way I couldn't before. I hung the bird feeder in my new yard, in a spot with good light, near a young maple that'll be beautiful in 10 years. Some mornings, I sit on the porch with my coffee and I watch it. Sparrows mostly, the occasional cardinal. Lorraine always loved cardinals. She would have found this whole situation funny, I think. She would have made me tell it at dinner parties. She would have laughed at the part where I drove to the title company to close on a house directly across from the one I'd just moved out of. She would have said, "Bernard, you absolute lunatic." And then she would have been very, very proud of me. I think about that on the good mornings. Most mornings now are good mornings. I used to think patience was the same as weakness. For most of my life, I thought the two looked identical from the outside. A man who doesn't fight back. A man who absorbs, who writes the checks and says nothing and tells himself he's keeping the peace. It took me until 67 years old, standing in an empty living room across the street from a house I'd helped buy, to understand the difference. What happened to me didn't happen overnight. That's the part people miss when they hear a story like this. They want to locate a single villain, a single moment, a single door that swung the wrong way. But the truth is that I walked through a series of open doors, each one reasonable looking on its own, and didn't notice until I was deep inside a house that had never really been mine. I gave generously because Lorraine raised me to believe that's what family does. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to make my son choose. Those were not wrong instincts, but somewhere along the way I confused generosity with surrender and silence with grace. There's a cost to that confusion, and eventually it comes due. My daughter-in-law didn't take anything from me that I hadn't already left unguarded. That's the honest accounting. She walked through a door I'd left open, not out of cruelty at the start, but out of something smaller and more ordinary. The belief that a man who gives without conditions will keep giving without limit. When I finally drew a line, she discovered it was load-bearing. They all did. What I'm most proud of, and I don't say this lightly, is that I didn't act out of anger. Anger would have been easier. Anger has a shape, a momentum. It carries you somewhere fast. What I did required something slower and harder. I had to think clearly while I was hurting, plan carefully while I felt invisible, and trust that doing the right thing for myself was not the same as doing something wrong to my son. That took more out of me than any job I worked in 31 years. Bernard Alcott across the street is not a punishment. It is a man who finally understood his own worth and arranged his life accordingly. Every morning I sit on that east-facing porch with my coffee, and I am reminded that the most important thing I ever built was not a financial contribution to someone else's household. It was the willingness, at 67, to start over with my name on the deed. I think about what I would tell a younger version of myself, or any man sitting in a room he's paid for but doesn't belong in. I'd tell him that integrity isn't just about how you treat other people. It's about whether you're willing to treat yourself with the same honesty. That wisdom isn't age, it's attention. Pay attention to what you're accepting. Pay attention to what you're telling yourself it means. And when the moment comes that requires you to act, quietly, clearly, without drama, find the strength to do it. Not for revenge, for the version of yourself that still has mornings left. The bird feeder is full. The cardinals come on cold days. I have chili on the stove and my son is coming Sunday. Most mornings now are good mornings.